Hey guys, tonight we start with ancient Greece male concubines, admired for your youth, praised for your education, and valued mainly for knowing when to stop talking. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before the sun, not because you're disciplined, virtuous, or chasing self-improvement, but because being awake is part of your job description. No one shakes you. No one has to. In this house, expectation works better than an alarm clock. Somewhere nearby, sandals scrape against stone. Water splashes into a basin. The household is already alive, functioning smoothly without ever asking how you slept. You get up carefully. Too slow looks lazy. Too fast looks eager. Both are mistakes. You stretch just enough to appear naturally graceful, because in ancient Greece, posture is a form of communication, and yours needs to say, pleasant, controlled, and absolutely not planning a rebellion. You wash your face with cool water. It wakes you up immediately, which is unfortunate. Being fully conscious this early only encourages inconvenient thoughts, like who you are and why you're here. Best to keep those suppressed until later. You are young. That's the headline. Everything else is footnotes. Your value has nothing to do with your personality, your dreams, or your long-term goals, which is convenient because you are not expected to have long-term goals. You are admired the way people admire a well-made statue, intensely, briefly, and without considering its opinions. No one addresses you with a title. Titles imply permanence. You exist in a comfortable grey area where everyone understands your role but pretends not to notice it. This social ambiguity protects everyone else from awkward conversations. You, meanwhile, get to enjoy the thrill of never quite knowing where you stand. You dress with care, clean garments, simple lines, nothing flashy, nothing plain enough to look neglected either. Greek masculinity worships balance, and you are expected to embody it effortlessly, as if you woke up like this. Trying too hard would be vulgar. Not trying at all would be insulting. Congratulations, you are now dressing for a philosophy. As you step into the courtyard, morning light catches you just right. You can feel the eyes, subtle but present. You are seen, appreciated, evaluated. You are valuable, just not important. There's a difference, and you learn it quickly. This is how your day begins, not imprisoned, not free, simply scheduled, and the sun hasn't even fully risen yet. By mid-morning, you're fully awake. Not because you've had caffeine, but because confusion is an excellent stimulant. You've been here long enough to notice something strange. No one ever clearly explains what you are. Not once. Not on your first day. Not now. It's as if the entire household silently agreed that defining your position out loud would somehow break the spell. You are not a citizen. That much is clear. Citizens get opinions, property, and the right to argue loudly in public spaces. You do none of those things. You are also not a slave in the traditional sense. No one beats you. No one chains you. No one sells you at the market like a sack of olives. Instead, you are treated politely, carefully, the way people handle expensive glassware they don't want to admit they bought. This leaves you floating in a social grey zone so vague it could qualify as a philosophical concept. If someone asked, "What exactly does he do?" the answer would be a long pause, followed by a vague gesture and a change of subject. You exist to accompany, to listen, to look appropriate next to someone important. Your presence adds polish, not function. You are social decoration, refined, educated, and expected to stay exactly where you're placed. What makes this arrangement especially clever is that it allows everyone else to feel morally comfortable. There are no contracts to explain, no labels to defend. You are simply there. And since no one has officially said what that means, no one feels responsible for how temporary your place might be. You quickly learn the rules. even though no one teaches them. You don't speak first. You don't linger where you're not invited. You don't ask questions about the future. Those are for people with legal standing. You, meanwhile, are encouraged to live very much in the present, preferably looking agreeable while doing so. Sometimes visitors look at you with curiosity, sometimes with admiration, occasionally with poorly disguised calculation. You smile politely because smiling is safe. Silence is safer. The strangest part is that everyone treats this ambiguity as perfectly normal. It's not cruel, it's not dramatic, it's just efficient. A system where everyone knows their place without the inconvenience of acknowledging it. And you? You adapt. You always do. Because clarity would require answers, and answers might require choices. And choices are not part of your role. By now, you understand that looking presentable in ancient Greece is not about self-expression. It's about risk management. Grooming is not vanity, it's strategy. Every detail of your appearance sends a message, and sending the wrong one can quietly rearrange your entire life. You bathe regularly, more regularly than most people around you, which is already an odd position to be in. You oil your skin, not to shine, but to signal health and youth. Too dry, and you look neglected. Too glossy, and you look indulgent. Once again, you are navigating the narrow philosophical corridor of just right, a concept the Greeks loved so much they built entire schools of thought around it. Hair matters. A lot. Too wild, and you look uncivilized. Too styled, and you look vain. You learn to keep it neat in a way that suggests nature did most of the work. This is the ideal. Effortless effort. Nothing in your life is effortless, but that's beside the point. You dress simply. Clean tunic. Neutral colours. Nothing flashy. Nothing that draws attention to itself, because attention, in your case, is a double-edged sword. Being noticed is good. Being remembered for the wrong reason is very bad. The goal is to be admired, and then immediately forgotten as an individual. You learn to move with restraint. No sudden gestures, no dramatic expressions. Your body is always being read by patrons, guests, rivals, and people deciding whether you are worth noticing at all. In a society obsessed with balance, symmetry, and moderation, you are expected to look like you walked out of a sculpture workshop. What no one tells you, but what you quickly figure out, is that your appearance is also a clock. Every bath, every careful adjustment of fabric, every glance in a reflective surface is a reminder that this look has an expiration date. Youth is not just valued here, it is consumed. You notice the older men watching younger faces more closely than yours now. Not yet with dismissal, but with calculation. You file that observation away and keep oiling your skin. You are not allowed to age poorly. You are not allowed to age loudly. And you are definitely not allowed to age unnoticed. So you groom. Carefully, strategically, quietly. Because in this world, your body isn't just yours. It's your resume, your insurance policy, and your exit plan. And you treat it accordingly. By the time breakfast arrives, you are already fully dressed, groomed, and emotionally prepared to say absolutely nothing. This is a skill you have mastered. In ancient Greece, silence is not awkward, it is respectful, especially when you are not technically supposed to exist as a speaking entity. The meal itself is modest. Bread, fruit, maybe cheese if someone is feeling generous. No one asks what you prefer. Preferences imply agency. Agency implies rights. Best not to start that chain of events before the first bite. You sit where you are told, or where you have learned to sit through careful observation. Seating is a language here. Who reclines, who sits upright, who eats first, who reaches for food without asking. All of it maps the invisible hierarchy of the household. You occupy a seat that says, present, appreciated, and not invited to contribute. Conversation flows around you like a river. Politics, philosophy, city gossip, upcoming festivals. You listen closely. Listening is encouraged. Speaking is optional and highly discouraged unless you are specifically prompted, and even then, brevity is a virtue. When someone does address you, it is usually with a harmless question, something safe, something ornamental, a line of poetry, a musical reference, never anything that might reveal what you actually think. You answer smoothly, carefully, like someone handling a fragile vase they did not purchase. You smile. Smiling is safe. You nod. Nodding is safer. You laugh lightly at jokes you are not fully allowed to find funny. Your laughter is timed, too loud, and you draw attention, too quiet, and you appear cold. This is not breakfast, it is a performance review. What makes it especially impressive is that no one acknowledges this performance. The men speaking do not pause to thank you for your restraint. They do not congratulate you on not embarrassing them. They simply continue talking, confident that the system works because it always has. As you eat, you notice how comfortable everyone else seems. They argue freely, interrupt each other, disagree loudly. These are privileges reserved for citizens, men whose identities are secure enough to survive conflict. You, meanwhile, exist in the pleasant calm of someone whose disagreement would be deeply inconvenient. So you chew slowly. You keep your eyes lowered just enough. You finish when others finish, not before, not after. Breakfast ends the way it began, quietly. And you leave the table exactly as you arrived, well-fed, well-behaved, and perfectly unremarkable, which, in your position, is the goal. After breakfast, you are gently reminded, without words, that your education is not a privilege. It is a requirement. An uneducated companion is an embarrassment, and embarrassment reflects poorly on the man who keeps you nearby. So you learn, constantly, whether you want to or not. You recite poetry, usually Homer, because Homer is safe. Everyone agrees Homer is impressive, and no one feels threatened by someone quoting a dead poet. You know entire passages by heart, not because you love them, but because forgetting a line would be awkward, and awkwardness is the enemy. Music follows. You practice quietly, carefully, never too enthusiastically. Skill is admirable. Passion is suspicious. You learn to play as if you enjoy it just enough, like a man who is talented but not ambitious. Ambition, after all, is for people with futures. Philosophy is introduced delicately. You are taught ideas, not arguments. Concepts, not conclusions. You can explain virtue, but you must not define it. You can reference reason, but you must not apply it too aggressively. You learn just enough to sound thoughtful at a symposium without accidentally undermining someone's worldview. This is a dangerous balancing act. Too ignorant, and you are boring. Too intelligent, and you become unsettling. The ideal is to appear insightful while remaining harmless, a walking footnote rather than a thesis. Your instructors never say this out loud, but the lesson is clear. Your mind exists to complement someone else's. You are intellectual seasoning, a garnish, never the main course. You notice how carefully knowledge is rationed. Certain topics are encouraged, others are quietly avoided. You are steered away from politics, law, and inheritance, subjects that suggest permanence. Instead, you are guided toward art, music, myth, and abstract virtue, things that are beautiful, timeless, and conveniently non-binding. As you learn, you become aware of the irony. You are receiving an education many free men would envy, and yet, this education is designed to go nowhere. You are being polished, not prepared. Still, you apply yourself. You memorize. You listen. You improve. Because in this world, learning is not about growth. It is about remaining useful. And usefulness, as you have already learned, is the closest thing you have to security. By now, you've learned that conversation is not about expression. It's about calibration. Every word you say must pass through an invisible filter that asks one crucial question. Will this make someone uncomfortable? If the answer is yes, even hypothetically, the thought stays inside your head where it belongs. You have mastered the art of saying just enough. When spoken to, you respond thoughtfully but briefly. You never speak first unless explicitly invited, and even then you wait a heartbeat longer than necessary, a subtle signal of restraint. In ancient Greece, restraint is attractive. Confidence is acceptable. Certainty, however, is dangerous. You learn to phrase opinions as echoes. As you said earlier, many wise men believe. It is often thought. This way, no idea ever fully belongs to you. You are not stating beliefs. You are displaying familiarity with them. Ownership implies authority. Authority is not your lane. Laughter requires similar discipline. Too loud and you look over-eager. Too soft and you appear cold. You laugh at jokes that are clever, tolerate jokes that are cruel, and pretend not to hear jokes that are aimed in your direction. This is not cowardice. This is professionalism. You become especially skilled at asking the right questions. Questions flatter without challenging. They invite others to speak while positioning you as attentive and intelligent. A good question can fill several minutes of conversation without requiring you to reveal anything meaningful about yourself. It's efficient. You like efficiency. Occasionally, someone pushes a little harder. They test you. Ask what you think, what you really think. This is never a genuine invitation. It's a social exercise, like poking a statue to see if it moves. You answer carefully, thoughtfully vague, elegantly incomplete. You offer insight without edges. Inside, you are aware of how absurd this is. You have thoughts, opinions, observations sharp enough to cut. You simply keep them sheathed. A dull blade survives longer. Over time, this careful speech changes you. You start editing your thoughts before they fully form. You become fluent in omission. You speak in a language built entirely on implication. Even alone, you notice yourself rehearsing answers no one has asked yet. This skill earns approval, compliments, a reputation for being well-mannered, pleasant, exceptionally composed. These words follow you like a gentle leash, and you accept them gladly. Because in your world, silence is safety, brevity is armor, and saying just enough is the difference between being admired and being remembered for the wrong reason. By midday, you understand that invisibility is no longer an option. Morning was about preparation. Afternoon is about presence. You are expected to be seen, not loudly, not proudly, but unmistakably. Existing quietly in the background is acceptable. Disappearing is not. You accompany your patron through the house, the courtyard, sometimes into public spaces where people conveniently pretend not to stare. You walk half a step behind, not far enough to look ashamed, not close enough to imply equality. The distance is precise, practiced, and silently enforced by years of observation. Eyes follow you. Some linger longer than others. You've learned to notice without reacting. Curiosity is common. Approval happens. Occasionally, there's envy. Not because people want your position, very few do, but because proximity to power always attracts interest. You are living proof that closeness does not equal control. You keep your posture relaxed, shoulders back, expression neutral. You've perfected the look of someone who belongs without claiming anything. You are decorative competence, a reminder that your patron is cultured, generous, and socially successful. You are not introduced. Introductions suggest relevance. Conversations continue around you as if you are a well-placed column. Functional, attractive, and incapable of interrupting. Sometimes people glance at you to measure time, mood, or status. You become part of the scenery, like a statue that occasionally blinks. You notice how easily your presence changes the tone of a room. Voices soften. Jokes adjust themselves mid-sentence. Certain subjects vanish entirely. You are not the reason, but you are the signal. People are reminded that appearances matter here. What surprises you most is how quickly this feels normal. The human mind adapts fast when comfort is involved. You stop wondering whether this is strange and start focusing on whether you are standing correctly. You are praised for composure, for grace, for knowing how to be. No one explains what that means. You are simply expected to continue doing it. Inside, you are aware of the irony. You are seen constantly, evaluated, noticed, discussed, yet almost never acknowledged directly. Being visible does not make you known, it only makes you useful. So you remain where you are placed. You move when expected. You smile when appropriate. You do not fidget. You do not wander. Because in this part of your day, presence is not optional. It is the work. At some point in the afternoon, usually when no one is speaking directly to you, the realization settles in, quietly, politely, like an unwanted guest who plans to stay. This life has a timer. No one mentions it. No one needs to. You can feel it ticking in the way glances linger just a second longer on someone younger than you, in the way compliments arrive slightly less often than they did before. Nothing dramatic, just enough to notice. Youth, here, is not a phase. It is a resource, a consumable one. You were chosen because you fit a very specific ideal, young enough to be admired, educated enough to be impressive, restrained enough to be safe. That combination does not last. Bodies change, faces sharpen or soften. A single year can shift how people see you, and in ancient Greece, perception is reality's manager. No one is cruel about it. That would be unnecessary. The system is far more efficient than cruelty. It simply redirects attention. New faces arrive. New potential appears. You notice them out of the corner of your eye. Younger, smoother, still unaware of the rules you've already memorized. You recognize yourself in them immediately, which is both comforting and deeply irritating. You start doing quiet math, not with numbers, that would require certainty, but with moments. How often you're asked to accompany someone. How often your presence is praised rather than merely accepted. How often someone looks past you instead of at you. None of this is discussed, because discussing it would acknowledge impermanence, and that would ruin the illusion for everyone involved. You respond the only way you can, by becoming better at everything that is not youth. Your manners sharpen. Your conversation grows smoother. Your awareness improves. You compensate gracefully, like a man adjusting his stance on a floor that's slowly tilting. The humor of it all doesn't escape you. You are admired for being fleeting, desired because you will not last. A perfectly designed contradiction. It would be funny if it weren't so quietly precise. Still, you do not panic. Panic would be unattractive. Instead, you maintain the illusion. Calm, composed, effortless. You become very good at pretending that time is not happening to you in real time. Because in this world, youth does not end with a ceremony. It simply fades, politely, while everyone pretends not to notice. And you learn to do the same. As daylight fades, the house begins its careful transformation. Lamps are lit. Cushions are arranged. Wine is diluted with water in proportions that will absolutely be ignored later. This is the part of the day everyone has been quietly preparing for, the symposium. Conversation, performance, philosophy, and ego, all reclining together very comfortably. You change garments, nothing dramatic. Evening requires refinement, not reinvention. You smooth the fabric, adjust it just enough to suggest effort without revealing it. You look like someone who belongs in lamplight. That is intentional. When you enter the room, voices continue without pause. That is your cue. You are present, which is expected. You are acknowledged indirectly. A glance, a slight nod, a satisfied silence. No introductions are made. Introductions would turn you into a topic, and topics invite opinions. You recline nearby, not among equals, but close enough to hear everything. Wine cups pass. Jokes begin. Some are clever, some are cruel, some are both, which earns the loudest laughter. You smile appropriately. You have learned that laughter is a currency, and overpaying is a mistake. Music fills the pauses. Poetry follows. Philosophy eventually arrives, as it always does, after enough wine has convinced everyone they are Socrates for the evening. You listen carefully. You are expected to understand the arguments. not contribute to them. Your comprehension reflects well on the man beside you. Your silence reflects even better. Occasionally, someone glances at you while making a point, as if checking whether beauty and understanding can coexist. You nod slightly. That's enough. You are not here to validate ideas. You are here to decorate them. As the night deepens, boundaries soften. Words stretch longer. Opinions grow bolder. You become more aware of your proximity, how close you are allowed to be, and how far you must remain emotionally. You exist in a carefully measured intimacy, close enough to matter, distant enough to be safe. You notice how often people look past you while speaking, not dismissively, habitually. You are part of the environment, like the cushions or the lamps, important to the mood, irrelevant to the outcome. Still, you remain composed. You listen. You absorb. You laugh softly when required. Because the symposium is not about truth. It is about performance. And tonight, like every night, you play your role perfectly. As the symposium stretches on, you realize your role has subtly shifted. Earlier, you were presence. Now, you are ambience. You have moved from noticed to assumed, which is the position you're meant to occupy for the rest of the evening. No one announces this transition. It simply happens, the way daylight quietly gives up without asking permission. You pour wine when asked. You refill cups before they're empty. You pass things smoothly, silently, efficiently. No one thanks you, because thanking would acknowledge effort, and your effort is meant to look invisible. You are very good at looking invisible while standing directly in the lamplight. Conversations grow louder, then softer, then philosophical in that uniquely Greek way where everyone agrees that truth is important and then immediately disagrees on what it is. You listen to arguments circle themselves like dogs chasing tails, each man convinced he is making progress. You nod at the right moments, as if understanding has gently brushed past you. Someone gestures in your direction while speaking, using you as a visual metaphor. You don't know what the metaphor is, but you smile anyway. It's safer. You are aware that you are being observed, even when no one is looking directly at you. Your posture, your expression, your stillness, all of it contributes to the tone of the room. If you look bored, the room feels dull. If you look uncomfortable, the mood tightens. If you look calm, everything flows. This is not pressure. This is just responsibility without credit. At some point, someone forgets your name, or never learned it. This does not surprise you. Names imply individuality, and individuality would complicate things. You are referred to instead by association. Him, the boy, our companion, titles without edges. You catch fragments of conversation drifting past you, plans, alliances, jokes that will be repeated elsewhere without context. You are close enough to hear everything and far enough away that nothing involves you. It's a peculiar kind of intimacy, like listening through a door that has been deliberately left ajar. As the night deepens, you remain composed. You do not fidget. You do not interrupt. You do not disappear. Because at this point in the evening, you are no longer a person in the room. You are the room's finishing touch. And you have learned that the finishing touch must never draw attention to itself. Eventually, someone turns to you and asks a question. This is not an accident. It is also not generosity. Questions, in this room, are tools, carefully selected, lightly used, and never meant to cut the hand holding them. What do you think? Someone asks, smiling in a way that suggests they already know what the correct answer should sound like. You understand the rules immediately. This is not a request for your opinion. This is a test of calibration. The safest answer is one that sounds thoughtful, agrees with the general mood, and somehow manages to say very little while taking just long enough to appear sincere. You respond with elegance and restraint. You reference a poet. You echo something someone else said earlier. You frame your thought as an observation rather than a conclusion. It lands perfectly. Impressive without being assertive, intelligent without being memorable. The room relaxes. You have passed. Compliments follow, but softly. Well said. Very measured. He's thoughtful. These words float around you like decorative ribbons, pleasant but ultimately meaningless. Praise here is not currency. It's reassurance. For them. It confirms that the system still works. Another question comes. This one slightly more personal. Still safe. Still fenced in. You answer again, carefully sanding down any sharp edges before the words leave your mouth. You are not lying. You are editing. What you do not say could fill the room. You do not mention how often the same arguments repeat themselves. You do not point out the contradictions everyone politely ignores. You do not suggest that certainty seems to grow in direct proportion to wine consumption. That would be rude and dangerous. Inside, you are amused. The irony is hard to miss. You are intelligent enough to see the gaps, educated enough to recognize weak reasoning, trained enough never to expose it. You are a mirror that reflects only flattering angles. Eventually, the questions stop. Not because you failed, but because you succeeded. You gave them exactly what they wanted. Confirmation without complication. You return to your role as atmosphere. Wine is poured. Laughter resumes. The room drifts forward as if nothing happened. And you remain where you are. Appreciated, approved, and quietly reminded that your voice matters most when it says the least. As the night deepens, you become increasingly aware of how close you are to power, and how firmly it refuses to acknowledge you. Important decisions are being discussed within arm's reach. Alliances are hinted at. Reputations are shaped with a sentence, sometimes a joke. Futures shift direction over wine cups you refill without comment. You hear everything, and yet none of it is meant for you. You learn quickly that proximity is not participation. You are allowed to listen, but never to steer. You are permitted to observe, but not to remember aloud. Knowledge settles into you like dust, unavoidable, accumulating, and strangely useless. You know who dislikes whom, who owes favours, who plans to embarrass a rival at the next assembly. This information could be powerful. In your hands, it is merely decorative. Occasionally someone lowers their voice instinctively, then notices you and relaxes. You are not a threat. That realization is both reassuring and quietly humiliating. You are trusted precisely because you are excluded. Power feels safe around you because it knows you cannot act on it. You wonder what would happen if you did speak. Not dramatically. Just carefully. What if you pointed out a flaw, a contradiction, a better solution? The thought is almost amusing. The room would freeze. Smiles would stiffen. Someone would laugh too loudly. And tomorrow, you would not be here. So you remain still, attentive, useful in silence. The irony sharpens. You are surrounded by men who believe themselves rational, enlightened, philosophical, and yet the system depends entirely on unspoken rules and mutual pretense. They debate virtue while relying on hierarchy. They praise reason while enforcing tradition. You who understand this perfectly are not allowed to say so. You notice how often power speaks confidently despite uncertainty, how rarely it admits doubt, how comfortable it is being wrong, as long as it is wrong loudly. You file these observations away. They will not help you here, but habits of noticing are hard to unlearn. As the evening winds down, decisions solidify. Plans form. Names are mentioned. None of them include yours. And that is intentional. You are close enough to feel the heat of authority, close enough to understand it, never close enough to touch it. And you learn the final rule of the room. Power does not need to silence you. It simply never invites you to speak. Eventually, the symposium begins to dissolve. Not dramatically. Nothing ever ends dramatically in a room full of men who enjoy hearing themselves speak, but gradually. Voices lower, arguments soften into anecdotes. Philosophy quietly gives up and wanders off in search of sleep. Oil lamps burn low. Shadows stretch across the walls, making everyone look more thoughtful than they actually are. This is the moment when the performance finally loosens its grip. For the first time all day, you are allowed to become slightly more human. You withdraw carefully, without drawing attention to the act of withdrawing. Leaving too early would seem rude. Staying too long would seem presumptuous. You have perfected the timing, exiting just as your presence stops being required, but before anyone notices, you are still there. Your sleeping space is modest but comfortable. This is not punishment. Ancient Greece does not consider your life harsh. In fact, by many standards, you are fortunate. You are clothed, fed, educated, protected. You are not beaten or starved. These facts are often offered as proof that everything is perfectly reasonable. You sit for a moment before lying down, letting the quiet settle. Your body finally relaxes now that it is no longer being read for meaning. No one is watching your posture. No one is listening for the tone of your voice. You exist without being evaluated, which feels almost indulgent, and yet this is also when thoughts arrive, uninvited and persistent, the kind you keep carefully folded away during the day. You think about how well you performed, about moments you handled cleanly, about small risks you avoided without anyone noticing. Survival, here, is measured in absence. There is a dry humour to it all that you can finally appreciate. You spent the entire evening surrounded by men discussing virtue, freedom, and excellence. And now you are alone in a room that quietly reminds you exactly how conditional those concepts are. You are not angry. Anger would require the belief that something is owed to you. Instead, you feel something quieter. Awareness. Clarity. The kind that comes from understanding the rules so well you no longer need to test them. As you lie down, the house settles. Lamps are extinguished one by one. Somewhere, someone laughs softly in their sleep. Tomorrow, you will wake early again. You will perform again, and once more, you will be exactly what is required. No more, no less. Lying awake in the dimness, you allow yourself a luxury you rarely indulge in during daylight hours. Honesty. Not spoken honesty. That would be reckless. But internal honesty, which is mostly harmless and occasionally sobering. You know, with uncomfortable clarity, that admiration is not security. It feels close to it. It imitates it convincingly. But it is not the same thing. Admiration depends on conditions, and you happen to be one of those conditions. Specifically, a temporary one. You think back to the way people looked at you earlier in the evening, appreciative, assessing, and sometimes, though never openly, already drifting past you, as if measuring the space you will eventually vacate. You are not ignored yet. That comes later. This is the polite middle stage, where interest softens but does not disappear. There is a strange comfort in understanding this. You no longer mistake praise for permanence. Compliments arrive and pass through you without lodging too deeply. You enjoy them, of course. You are not made of stone. But you also recognize them for what they are. Acknowledgements of present usefulness, not promises of future relevance. You have seen what happens to those who age out of their appeal. They do not vanish overnight. They linger. Their invitations grow less frequent. Their presence becomes optional. Then eventually, inconvenient. No ceremony marks the transition. No announcement is made. The system simply adjusts itself and moves on. You find a thin thread of dry amusement in all this. The men who spent the evening debating ideals of excellence and virtue are just as dependent on time as you are. They simply pretend otherwise. Their authority protects them from being replaced as easily. Yours does not. Still, you are not bitter. Bitterness requires expectation, and you learned early not to expect too much. Instead, you cultivate adaptability. You refine your manners. You sharpen your awareness. You make yourself useful in ways that are not immediately obvious. This is not hope. It is strategy. You understand now that your role is not to endure forever, but to exit cleanly, to leave without disruption, to fade without causing discomfort. And oddly enough, there is dignity in that. A quiet kind, unacknowledged, but real. You close your eyes knowing this truth. You are admired. You are valued. And you are already being prepared for replacement. Tomorrow you will perform again, calmly, beautifully, and with just enough distance to protect yourself. By the time sleep finally takes you, you understand something clearly. Clearer than any philosophy discussed at the symposium. Clearer than any polite compliment you've received all day. Your life is not a tragedy, but it is also not a story of freedom. It is something far more ancient and far more precise. You were never meant to own this life. You were meant to occupy it. A day in the life of a male concubine in ancient Greece is not filled with constant suffering, nor is it drenched in indulgence. It is measured, structured, carefully balanced. You are educated, but not empowered, admired, but not equal, close enough to power to feel its warmth, yet far enough away to never be burned by it, unless you forget your place. There is a strange efficiency to it all. The system does not rely on cruelty. It relies on silence, expectation, and the shared understanding that not everyone is meant to last. You are valuable because you are temporary. You are desirable because you will not remain. This contradiction sits at the heart of your existence, quietly humming beneath every interaction. And you adapt. Humans always do. You learn to read rooms, to speak without asserting, to listen without absorbing too much hope. You develop instincts sharper than many free men ever need. Instincts born from knowing that your security depends not on laws or rights, but on how well you navigate invisible boundaries. There is dry humor in that, if you allow yourself to see it. Entire evenings are spent discussing virtue, excellence, and reason, while your own life is shaped by rules no one ever admits exist. The irony would be delicious if it weren't so calmly enforced. Yet, you are not nothing. That matters. You are not erased. You are seen, appreciated, remembered, at least for a while. And in a world obsessed with legacy, sometimes being fully present in the moment is its own quiet achievement. Tomorrow, you will wake early again. You will groom. You will listen. You will say just enough. And one day, without drama, you will leave this role behind, replaced, absorbed, or quietly redirected into something less visible. That is not failure. That is how the system works. And now you understand it completely. Which, in ancient Greece, is as close to freedom as you are likely to get. 19th century New York did not grow the way cities are supposed to grow. It did not expand neatly outward, planning streets and services as it went. Instead, it exploded. Ships unloaded thousands of newcomers every week, and the city absorbed them the way a battlefield absorbs bodies. Quickly, violently, and without much care for what happened next. By the 1840s and 50s, New York was already the largest city in the United States, but it had none of the systems needed to manage that scale. No real welfare, no reliable policing, no meaningful public housing. What it did have was density, crushing, suffocating density. Entire families were stacked into narrow tenements, where light barely reached the floor and disease moved faster than gossip. Streets were muddy, unlit, and loud at all hours. Work was scarce and often temporary. If you were injured, you were finished. If you were new, poor, and foreign, you were invisible. This was not a place where the law protected you. It was a place where you protected yourself, or joined someone who could. Out of this chaos, gangs emerged not as random criminals, but as substitutes for institutions that barely existed. They offered protection, food, work connections, and a sense of belonging in a city that treated newcomers as disposable. Neighborhoods quickly became territories, and territory meant survival. If you lived on a certain street, spoke a certain language, or worshipped in a certain church, your safety depended on who controlled that block. Cross the wrong boundary, and the city reminded you who was really in charge. These gangs were deeply tied to ethnicity. Irish, Italian, German, and native-born Protestant groups formed along cultural lines, each bringing old rivalries into a new environment. The city became a mosaic of micro-empires, each ruled by its own codes, loyalties, and grudges. Violence was not constant chaos. It was regulated, purposeful and often ritualized. Fights sent messages. Riots enforced boundaries. Bloodshed was communication. What made New York especially fertile ground was the absence of a strong central authority willing to intervene. Police forces were understaffed, corrupt, or openly partisan. Politicians relied on gang leaders to deliver votes and intimidate opponents. Courts were slow and easily manipulated. In this vacuum, gangs became the de facto managers of urban life, deciding who could work, who could live where, and who could walk safely after dark. By the time reformers began calling New York ungovernable, the gangs were already deeply rooted. They were not invaders of the city. They were one of its first true systems, born from neglect, sustained by desperation, and perfectly adapted to a city that rewarded strength far more than fairness. If the city created the gangs, identity kept them alive. In 19th century New York, who you were mattered less than who you belonged to. Your accent, your church, the way you dressed, even the street you slept on could decide whether you were protected or hunted. Gangs filled the emotional and practical vacuum left by a society that offered immigrants little dignity and even less mercy. They were not just violent groups. They were surrogate families forged under pressure. Most recruits were young men, often teenagers, raised in overcrowded tenements where privacy did not exist, and authority figures were either absent or hostile. Traditional paths to respect, education, steady work, social mobility, were largely closed. Gangs offered an alternative ladder. Loyalty replaced legality. Reputation replaced wealth. Violence replaced opportunity. To be feared was to be safe. Initiation into a gang was rarely ceremonial, but it was always brutal. You proved yourself through action, standing your ground in a street fight, enforcing territory, or attacking a rival group without hesitation. Courage was valued, but obedience mattered more. The gang demanded loyalty above family, religion, or law. Betrayal was punished swiftly and publicly, because fear was the glue that held these organizations together. Each gang cultivated its own identity through symbols and behavior. Clothing styles, shaved heads, colored scarves, or distinctive hats marked affiliation. Songs, slang, and gestures reinforced belonging. Even walking patterns mattered. A member learned how to move through streets in a way that signaled confidence and ownership. This was not accidental. Visibility deterred challengers and reassured allies. To look weak was to invite attack. Ethnic pride intensified these bonds. Irish gangs clung to shared memories of famine and British oppression. Native-born groups saw themselves as defenders of true American identity against foreign intrusion. These narratives justified violence by framing it as defense rather than aggression. Every brawl became a moral act, every riot a righteous response to insult or threat. What made gang identity so powerful was its permanence. Leaving was nearly impossible. A former member carried scars, enemies, and reputations that followed him across neighborhoods. Neutrality did not exist. You were either protected or exposed. Many men stayed not because they loved the life, but because survival outside it was far more dangerous. In a city where institutions failed to recognize them as citizens, gangs gave men a name, a role, and a purpose. It was a violent form of belonging. But in 19th century New York, belonging of any kind was a rare and precious thing. In 19th century New York, power was measured in feet, not miles. A single street corner could be worth fighting over, and a tavern could be more valuable than a bank. Gang territory was not marked by signs or fences, but everyone knew where the borders were. You learned them quickly, usually the hard way. Cross the wrong street at the wrong hour, and the city corrected your mistake with fists, knives, or worse. Territory mattered because it controlled daily life. Gangs dominated docks, markets, construction sites, and entertainment districts, deciding who worked and who starved. A gang that held a dock could extort labourers, skim wages, or block rival groups entirely. Control of a theatre or dance hall meant influence over crowds, money from ticket sales, and a steady flow of recruits. These were not random acts of thuggery. They were economic strategies adapted to an informal urban economy. Taverns sat at the centre of this system. They were headquarters, recruitment offices, and neutral ground all at once. A single saloon could serve as a meeting place, a weapons cache, and a refuge from police attention. Tavern owners often cooperated willingly, trading protection for loyalty. If trouble broke out, the doors closed, windows shattered, and the street outside became a battlefield. Inside, deals were struck over cheap whiskey and shared grudges. Territory was enforced through routine violence. Patrols walked familiar routes, not unlike soldiers guarding a frontier. Graffiti, smashed lamps, and broken furniture acted as warnings. Rival gangs tested boundaries constantly, probing for weakness. A small insult, a shove, a stare, a spilled drink, could escalate into a riot because it was never really about the insult. It was about dominance. What made these borders so effective was community participation. Residents might not belong to the gang, but they understood the rules. Shopkeepers paid protection fees. Tenants warned members of approaching rivals. Children acted as messengers. Silence was currency. Speaking to police was betrayal, and betrayal was fatal. In this way, entire neighborhoods became complicit in gang rule, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. These invisible borders turned New York into a patchwork of hostile microstates, each with its own laws and enforcers. Moving across the city required careful planning, alliances, or disguises. For outsiders, it felt chaotic. For insiders, it was structured, predictable, and brutally efficient. Like ancient Rome's crowded districts, where street gangs once battled for influence, New York's neighborhoods functioned as arenas of constant negotiation. Power was local, fragile, and always contested, measured one tavern, one alley, and one broken body at a time. By the mid-19th century, New York's gangs were no longer just street forces. They were political tools. As the city expanded, so did the need to control it, and politicians quickly realized that no one mobilized crowds faster or more effectively than the gangs. Elections in New York were not quiet civic rituals. They were loud, chaotic, and often violent, and gangs stood at the center of that chaos. Political parties depended on gang leaders to deliver votes, intimidate opponents, and manage polling places. On election days, gang members crowded the entrances to voting stations, deciding who could pass and who could not. Ballot boxes disappeared, reappeared, or were mysteriously stuffed. Men voted multiple times under different names, or were beaten until they agreed to vote the correct way. This was not corruption at the margins. It was the system functioning as designed. In return, gangs received protection and influence. Arrests vanished. Charges were dropped. Police officers looked the other way. Gang leaders gained access to city jobs, contracts, and licenses, which they distributed as rewards for loyalty. Street power translated into political capital, and political capital reinforced street power. It was a closed loop that benefited everyone involved, except ordinary residents caught in the middle. Tammany Hall perfected this relationship. By presenting itself as a champion of immigrant communities, it used gangs as intermediaries between government and the streets. Gang leaders spoke the language of the neighborhoods in ways politicians never could. They attended funerals, paid rent for struggling families, and provided food during hard winters. These acts were not charity, they were investments. Gratitude became obligation, and obligation became votes. Violence served politics just as effectively as persuasion. Opposing rallies were disrupted. Reform speakers were heckled, threatened, or assaulted. Newspapers' offices were smashed if coverage became too critical. The message was clear. Power in New York did not flow solely from laws or ideals. It flowed from the ability to command bodies in the street. This fusion of gangs and politics mirrored much older urban systems. In ancient cities, political factions often relied on neighborhood toughs to enforce loyalty and silence rivals. New York followed the same pattern, simply with modern accents and different uniforms. The city's democracy functioned less like a debate and more like a negotiated truce between armed groups. By the time reformers demanded clean elections, gangs were already entrenched in the political machinery. They were not outside the system. They were one of its most reliable moving parts, greasing the gears with fear, favours, and controlled chaos. Riots in 19th century New York were not accidents. They were pressure valves. When economic stress, ethnic tension, and political manipulation built up beyond control, the city released it through collective violence. Gangs did not simply participate in riots. They organised them, guided them, and decided when they would end. To outsiders, these explosions looked like madness. To those inside the system, they were grimly familiar. Most riots followed a pattern. A rumour spread. An insult was exaggerated. A perceived injustice, real or manufactured, was repeated until it felt undeniable. Gangs then mobilised quickly, pulling men from taverns, workshops, and tenements. Within hours, streets filled with bodies, clubs, and makeshift weapons. The goal was not just destruction, it was demonstration. Riots showed who controlled the neighbourhood and how far that control extended. Ethnic riots were the most common and the most brutal. Long-standing resentments between Irish immigrants, African Americans, and native-born Protestants erupted repeatedly. Gangs framed these conflicts as defensive actions, claiming they were protecting jobs, housing, or moral order. In reality, riots often served to consolidate power by driving rivals out of contested areas. Burned homes and smashed businesses created new borders overnight. The draft riots of 1863 exposed this dynamic at its most extreme. Anger over conscription laws merged with class resentment and racial hatred, producing days of unchecked violence. Gangs led attacks on government buildings, wealthy homes, and black communities. Police forces collapsed. The army had to be brought in to restore order. What looked like spontaneous fury was, in many cases, guided by men who knew exactly where to strike and why. Riots also reinforced internal discipline. Participation proved loyalty. Refusal marked weakness. Men who hesitated risked losing protection or status. In this way, riots functioned as both external aggression and internal purification. Violence bonded participants, creating shared guilt and shared memory that deepened allegiance. Authorities often responded inconsistently. Sometimes they crushed riots with overwhelming force. Other times they negotiated quietly with gang leaders, trading concessions for calm. This inconsistency taught gangs an important lesson. Chaos was leverage. The threat of disorder became a bargaining chip, deployed whenever political or economic demands were ignored. Like the bread riots and factional violence of ancient cities, New York's riots were woven into urban life. They were not failures of the system, but expressions of it, moments when hidden power became visible, and the city briefly revealed who truly commanded its streets. Law enforcement in 19th century New York existed in theory long before it functioned in reality. Police forces were understaffed, poorly trained, and deeply entangled with the same political networks that relied on gangs. Officers were often recruited through patronage rather than merit, which meant loyalty to party bosses mattered more than loyalty to the law. In such an environment, policing became another negotiable service rather than an impartial authority. Many officers lived in the same neighbourhoods they were supposed to police. They drank in the same taverns, worshipped in the same churches, and relied on the same political machines for job security. This proximity blurred boundaries. Turning a blind eye to gang activity was not always cowardice. It was survival. Arrest the wrong man, and an officer might find his windows smashed, his family threatened, or his career quietly ended. Corruption was both systemic and routine. Gangs paid for protection through cash, favours, or votes delivered on election day. In return, raids were delayed, patrols redirected, and evidence misplaced. When violence erupted, police response depended on who was involved. Some gangs were tolerated, even assisted. while others were targeted as expendable. Justice was uneven, predictable, and deeply political. Selective enforcement allowed gangs to operate openly. Street fights occurred in broad daylight. Weapons were carried without fear of search. Known gang leaders walked free, while minor offenders filled jails. This imbalance reinforced the perception that real power lay outside official institutions. For ordinary residents, calling the police often made things worse, marking them as informants and inviting retaliation. Attempts at reform faced fierce resistance. Efforts to professionalize the police threatened the political alliances that sustained the system. Reformers were portrayed as outsiders who did not understand the city's real needs. Newspapers allied with political machines mocked them as naive or dangerous. When reforms did succeed, they were often temporary, undone by the next election cycle. Ironically, the police also learned to use gangs strategically. Informants were recruited from rival groups. Selective crackdowns weakened certain factions while strengthening others. In some cases, police violence mirrored gang tactics, blurring the moral distinction between enforcer and criminal. Authority became another form of force competing for dominance in the streets. This dynamic echoed ancient urban centres, where watchmen and magistrates often cooperated with local strongmen to maintain order. New York followed the same logic. Stability mattered more than justice. Predictable corruption was preferable to uncontrolled violence. By the late 19th century, the line between gang and guardian was dangerously thin. Policing did not eliminate gangs. It shaped them, tolerated them, and sometimes quietly relied on them. In doing so, the city ensured that gang power remained a permanent feature of its urban life, rather than a temporary crisis. By the late 19th century, the world that had created New York's great street gangs began to change. The city was still violent and unequal, but it was no longer as lawless as before. Professional police forces expanded. Reform movements gained traction. Streets were paved, lit, and increasingly surveilled. The old gang model, built on open territorial control and public violence, became harder to sustain. Crackdowns did not arrive all at once. They came unevenly, neighborhood by neighborhood, often targeting the most visible groups first. Famous gangs that once ruled entire districts were broken apart through arrests, forced migrations, and internal betrayal. Leaders were imprisoned or killed. Others adapted, becoming quieter and more selective. Violence did not disappear. It became less theatrical. At the same time, demographics shifted. Second-generation immigrants were more integrated into city life. Some found legitimate work, education, or political influence without relying on gang protection. Ethnic boundaries softened, and old rivalries lost their urgency. The fierce identity politics that fueled earlier gang warfare gave way to new forms of competition rooted more in class than culture. Many former gang members transitioned into organized crime. Instead of controlling streets, they controlled businesses: gambling, prostitution, extortion, and bootlegging. Power moved indoors, away from public brawls and toward backroom deals. The skills learned in street gangs, discipline, loyalty, intimidation, translated easily into these new enterprises. What changed was visibility, not intent. Others simply disappeared into the city's labor force. Aging gang members took jobs as dock workers, factory hands, or political operatives. Their pasts were rarely discussed, but the habits remained. Silence, suspicion, and readiness for violence became ingrained survival traits passed down through families and neighborhoods. Reformers celebrated the decline of the old gangs as a victory of civilization over chaos. In reality, the city had not eliminated its reliance on informal power structures. It had reorganized them. The street gave way to the union hall, the club, the syndicate. Violence became a tool used sparingly, strategically, and out of sight. This transformation mirrored patterns seen throughout history. Ancient cities also moved from open factional violence to quieter forms of elite control as institutions strengthened. The chaos did not vanish. It was absorbed into more complex systems. By the dawn of the 20th century, the gangs that once terrorized New York's streets were mostly gone in name. But their legacy endured in the city's underworld, political culture, and collective memory. The streets were calmer, but the methods of power, loyalty, fear, and controlled disorder remained deeply familiar. Even as 19th century New York moved toward reform, its gang culture revealed something timeless about crowded cities. The behavior felt modern, but the structure was ancient. Long before New York's tenements, Rome's insulae had housed the poor in dangerous, overcrowded conditions. Long before Irish and nativist gangs clashed over docks and streets, Roman factions fought over grain, patronage, and political favour. The setting changed. The logic did not. In Rome, urban gangs were often tied to powerful patrons. Politicians relied on neighbourhood toughs to disrupt assemblies, intimidate rivals, and sway public opinion. These men were not criminals in the modern sense. They were political instruments. New York followed the same blueprint. Gang leaders acted as intermediaries between elites and the streets, translating influence into physical force when persuasion failed. Both cities suffered from weak or compromised law enforcement. Roman magistrates lacked the manpower to police massive populations, and New York's early police forces faced similar limitations. In both cases, authorities tolerated local strongmen because they maintained a form of order. Violence was preferable to unpredictability. As long as it stayed within accepted boundaries, it was allowed to continue. Public space played a critical role. Rome's forums and circuses were arenas for factional display, just as New York's taverns, docks, and streets became stages for gang power. Visibility mattered. To be seen controlling a space was to control the narrative of authority. Fear spread faster when it was witnessed. There was also a shared psychology. In both cities, marginalized populations clung to group identity as a defense against exclusion. Loyalty to faction replaced trust in institutions. Justice became something negotiated collectively rather than guaranteed individually. When systems failed, people turned to those who could deliver immediate results, even if the cost was bloodshed. The comparison unsettles modern assumptions. It suggests that New York's gang era was not a temporary deviation, but a predictable phase in urban development. When population growth outpaces governance, informal power structures emerge. They fill gaps left by law, economy, and social cohesion. Rome eventually absorbed its gangs into imperial administration, or crushed them when they became inconvenient. New York did something similar, integrating street power into political machines and organized crime before suppressing it under stronger institutions. In both cases, the city survived by adapting, not by purging chaos entirely. These echoes remind us that cities are not just collections of buildings. They are living systems. When they strain, they revert to ancient solutions: violence, loyalty, and patronage, no matter how modern they appear. By the end of the 19th century, New York no longer looked like a city ruled by gangs. Streets were wider, police uniforms more standardized, elections more regulated, at least on paper. But cities do not forget easily. The memory of gang rule lingered in habits, institutions, and unspoken rules that shaped urban life long after the last great street gangs faded from view. Former gang leaders often resurfaced as respectable figures. Some became ward bosses, union organizers, or business owners. Their authority no longer depended on fists in the street, but the instincts remained the same. They understood leverage, loyalty, and fear better than any reformer. In quieter ways, they continued to influence who got jobs, who received favors, and who was pushed aside. Violence was no longer public, but it remained an option. Neighborhoods carried scars as well. Invisible borders softened but never fully disappeared. Certain streets retained reputations passed down through generations. Parents warned children where not to wander. Tavern culture evolved, but the idea that social spaces could also be centers of power never vanished. Even the language of the city, talk of turf, respect, and standing your ground, echoed the old gang logic. Popular culture turned the gang era into legend. Newspapers, novels, and later films romanticized the violence, often stripping it of its desperation and brutality. Gangs became symbols of rebellion, toughness, or gritty authenticity. What was forgotten was how deeply rooted they were in poverty, exclusion, and institutional failure. The myths survived because they were easier to digest than the reality. Most importantly, the gang era left a lesson embedded in the city's structure. Order imposed without inclusion breeds informal power. When people feel unprotected, they seek protection wherever it is offered. New York learned this slowly, through bloodshed and reform, adjusting its institutions only after chaos forced its hand. This pattern has repeated across time and place. From ancient cities to modern megacities, the story remains consistent. When governance lags behind growth, loyalty replaces law. When justice feels distant, violence feels immediate. Gangs are not anomalies. They are symptoms. New York survived its age of gangs not because it became morally superior, but because it became administratively stronger. It expanded opportunity just enough, enforced order just enough, and remembered, often uncomfortably, what happens when it does not. The city moved on. But beneath the glass, steel, and noise of modern New York, the old logic still hums quietly. A reminder that urban chaos is never truly gone, only managed, delayed, and waiting for the moment when the city forgets how it was once ruled. In ancient Rome, daylight was a fragile illusion of order. Once the sun disappeared behind temples and rooftops, the city shed its civic mask. Shops slammed their shutters. Families retreated upstairs. Doors were barred, bolts slid into place, and lamps were turned low to avoid drawing attention. Nightfall did not signal rest. It signaled surrender. Rome after dark belonged to those willing to move through it armed, drunk, or desperate. The streets were narrow, crooked, and uneven, paved with stones polished slick by centuries of feet. There was no street lighting as we would understand it. A few public lamps existed near major intersections, but most neighborhoods were swallowed by darkness. Shadows pooled in doorways and under staircases. A single lantern could betray your position from half a street away. For ordinary citizens, walking at night meant gambling with injury, theft, or death. Ancient writers complained constantly about it. Juvenal warned that going out after dark was an invitation to violence. Seneca described the noise of nighttime Rome as a mixture of shouting, fighting, and drunken chaos. Wagons rattled illegally through the streets. Tavern crowds spilled into alleys. Somewhere nearby, someone was always screaming, sometimes in anger, sometimes in pain, sometimes just because wine demanded it. Criminals thrived in this environment. Thieves waited in doorways or behind columns, watching silhouettes instead of faces. Armed youth gangs roamed in groups, using numbers rather than stealth. They carried clubs, knives, or whatever could break bones quickly and quietly. Robbery was not subtle. Victims were knocked down, stripped of valuables, and left bleeding on the stones. Help rarely came. Neighbours stayed silent, knowing intervention only invited retaliation. The architecture of Rome made things worse. Many buildings were tall insulae packed with poor residents. Upper floors leaned over the street, blocking moonlight. Garbage, chamber pots, and worse were dumped from windows without warning. You could be assaulted from above as easily as from behind. Even without criminals, the night itself was hazardous. Elites understood this reality well. Senators and wealthy citizens avoided nighttime travel entirely, unless escorted by slaves with torches and weapons. Invitations ended early. Social life shrank inward. Darkness was treated as hostile territory, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Rome never truly slept. It merely changed hands. When law, visibility, and authority withdrew, another order filled the vacuum. One ruled by fear, familiarity with the streets, and the simple truth that after dark, survival favoured those who belonged to the night. Once darkness settled over Rome, theft became routine rather than exceptional. Crime was not confined to distant alleys or notorious districts. It happened everywhere, because the city itself made it easy. Narrow streets forced pedestrians close together. Blind corners offered instant cover. Noise from taverns and traffic masked footsteps and muffled cries for help. A thief did not need sophistication. He needed timing. Most robberies were blunt and fast. Victims were shoved against walls, struck with a club, or tripped and swarmed by accomplices. Knives appeared not for elegance, but for speed. The goal was not murder, but compliance. Money, rings, belts, and cloaks were stripped away in seconds. A man left alive but injured was less trouble than a corpse that demanded attention from authorities. Still, deaths were common enough to be unremarkable. Criminals learned to read the night. A lone figure walking with purpose was often avoided, assumed to be armed or accompanied. A hesitant walker, pausing to listen or glance behind him, was marked immediately. Wealth announced itself through clothing, footwear, and posture. The city trained predators well. Rome was their classroom. Victims had few defences. Carrying a weapon could lead to arrest if discovered, but walking unarmed invited attack. Some carried hidden knives or weighted sticks. Others travelled in groups, even for short distances. Many simply avoided the streets altogether after sunset. For those who could not, slaves, labourers, messengers, the risk was unavoidable. Night work paid in fear. Street violence was not always about robbery. Drunken brawls erupted without warning. Insults escalated quickly in the dark, where faces were unclear and reputations mattered more than reason. A careless shoulder bump could turn into a beating. Rival groups clashed over territory, women, or perceived slights. Bloodshed followed no clear rules, only momentum. What made this violence persistent was its invisibility to power. Magistrates were not patrolling alleys at midnight. Night watchmen were few and unreliable. Witnesses vanished behind closed doors. Crime after dark rarely reached court unless the victim was wealthy or well-connected. For everyone else, it was an expected hazard, like fire or disease. Ancient Rome prided itself on law, order, and civilization. But at night, those ideals thinned to paper. The darkness stripped away ceremony and exposed a harsher truth. The city's safety depended on daylight. When the sun fell, Rome reverted to something older and more primal, a place where strength, numbers, and instinct mattered far more than laws written for the day. Not all violence in Rome after dark was opportunistic. Much of it was organized, social, and disturbingly youthful. Groups of young men roamed the streets at night in loose gangs, bound not by formal hierarchy, but by shared background, boredom, and bravado. Ancient sources describe them as loud, reckless, and quick to violence, products of a city that offered ambition without direction. These gangs were often made up of freedmen, apprentices, and sons of the urban poor. Too young for authority and too restless for obedience, they treated the night as a proving ground. Strength, aggression, and fearlessness became currencies. To be seen dominating the street meant status. To retreat meant ridicule. Violence was performance as much as conflict. Armed with clubs, stones, and knives, these youths patrolled familiar routes, claiming territory through repetition rather than declaration. They recognized one another by voice, clothing, and posture. Outsiders were immediately noticeable. A stranger, walking confidently through a group's usual haunt, invited challenge. Questions were shouted. Insults followed. Silence was interpreted as weakness. Roman writers complained bitterly about them. Seneca and Tacitus portrayed these gangs as symptoms of moral decay, blaming idleness and excess. Juvenal mocked their drunken bravado, but acknowledged their danger. Even elites who avoided night travel feared these groups, not because they were professional criminals, but because they were unpredictable. Drunken courage is more dangerous than calculated malice. These gangs did not always attack for profit. Many assaults were about dominance, humiliation, or amusement. Victims were beaten, stripped, or left injured simply to prove a point. The randomness added to the terror. You could follow every rule and still become a target. Survival depended less on behavior and more on timing and luck. Authorities struggled to control them. Arresting one member often triggered retaliation from others. Punishments were inconsistent, especially if a gang included the sons of influential families. Wealth and connections softened consequences, reinforcing the idea that violence at night carried little risk for those with the right backing. In some cases, these street brotherhoods evolved into something more formal. Members aged, gained influence, and carried their loyalties into politics, business, or patronage networks. What began as nocturnal chaos sometimes matured into daytime power. Rome after dark was therefore not just criminal, it was generational. The streets became a training ground where young men learned that force commanded respect and solidarity ensured survival. Lessons learned in shadow followed them into the light, shaping the city long after the night had passed. As daylight faded, Rome's taverns grew louder. These were not cozy social spaces, but volatile pressure chambers where alcohol, frustration, and proximity mixed badly. Wine flowed cheaply and often diluted, but its effect was reliable. By nightfall, many taverns were crowded with labourers, sailors, freedmen, and gangs of youths already primed for conflict. What happened inside rarely stayed inside. Taverns served as informal headquarters for street groups. They provided shelter, information, and a place to size up rivals. A glance held too long. A joke misheard or a perceived insult could spark violence. Once tempers flared, restraint vanished quickly. There were no bouncers, no effective oversight, and little fear of punishment. When fights erupted, furniture became weapons and doorways turned into choke points. Drunken crowds spilled into the streets, expanding conflict beyond the tavern walls. What began as a private dispute became a public spectacle. Bystanders were dragged in, willingly or not. Gangs used these moments to assert dominance, turning chaos into territorial display. Noise mattered. Shouting and singing announced presence and warned rivals. Silence meant weakness. Wine lowered barriers between social classes in dangerous ways. Slaves drank alongside freedmen. Citizens argued with foreigners. Grievances that simmered during the day erupted at night, sharpened by alcohol and anonymity. A man insulted by a superior in daylight might seek revenge after dark. When witnesses were fewer and recognition uncertain, ancient authors described taverns as moral sinkholes, but their role was structural as much as cultural. They existed because people needed release from the city's relentless pressure. Overcrowding, poverty, and limited mobility left few safe outlets for frustration. Taverns provided space, noise, and temporary escape. Violence was a predictable side effect. Authorities rarely intervened unless disorder threatened elite neighborhoods. Patrols avoided tavern districts at night, knowing numbers favored the crowd. When crackdowns did occur, they were brief and symbolic. Closing a tavern only displaced activity to another street. The demand remained. Taverns also functioned as information hubs. News travelled fast after dark, distorted by rumour and bravado. A fight in one district could trigger retaliation elsewhere by morning. Alliances formed over shared drinks. Grudges deepened with every cup. Rome after dark was shaped by these spaces. Taverns transformed individual anger into collective force. They blurred boundaries between crime, recreation, and politics. When the night grew loud, it was often because wine had turned private resentments into public violence, leaving the streets to absorb the consequences by dawn. Rome did have a system meant to keep order after dark. It simply did not work the way modern readers might expect. The city's night watchmen, the vigiles, were officially responsible for fire prevention and nighttime security. In reality, they were overstretched, underpaid, and often unwilling to confront the most dangerous elements of the streets. Their presence offered reassurance, not safety. The vigiles patrolled in small groups, carrying lanterns, buckets, and basic weapons. Fire was their primary concern, and with good reason. Rome's buildings were packed tightly together, constructed from wood and cheap materials. A single unattended lamp could destroy an entire district. Thieves and gangs understood this. As long as no flames were visible, patrols were unlikely to intervene. Confronting armed gangs was not part of the job. A few watchmen facing a dozen drunken youths was a losing proposition. Intervention required confidence, numbers, and authority. 3 things the vigiles rarely had at night. When violence broke out, their most common response was to observe, retreat, and report later, assuming there would still be someone alive to report. Corruption further weakened their role. Bribes ensured safe passage for criminals. Familiar faces were ignored. Informants paid for protection by directing patrols away from certain streets. The watchman became part of the night's ecosystem rather than its enemy. Order existed, but it was negotiated. For elites, the vigiles were enough. Wealthy districts were quieter, better lit, and less crowded. Slaves and guards handled protection privately. The illusion of control held because disorder was concentrated elsewhere. For the poor, the night watch was little more than a rumour. Ancient writers mocked this system openly. Complaints about lawlessness after dark appear again and again in Roman literature. The gap between Rome's imperial authority and its nighttime reality was obvious to anyone forced to walk home after sunset. The existence of the vigiles did not eliminate crime. It redistributed risk. Ordinary people learned that safety depended on timing, route, and reputation, not on law enforcement. Criminals learned exactly how far they could push without consequence. Rome maintained order through spectacle and daylight enforcement. At night, that spectacle vanished. Authority dimmed with the lamps. What remained was an understanding shared by everyone who lived there. The city's power slept, and in its absence, survival belonged to those who knew the streets better than the law ever could. Rome's wealthy did not conquer the night. They avoided it. As darkness spread across the city, elite life contracted inward, retreating behind walls, guards, and carefully timed routines. Senators, equestrians, and prominent households planned their days around one rule: be home before sunset or travel only with protection. Night was not glamorous or mysterious to them. It was hostile territory. Elite houses were designed with this fear in mind. Thick walls, heavy doors, and interior courtyards reduced exposure to the street. Upper floors kept families physically distant from danger below. Slaves slept near entrances. Dogs were kept as early warning systems. Lamps were used sparingly, since light signaled wealth and movement. Silence was security. If elites had to move at night, they did so conspicuously. Slaves carried torches. Armed escorts surrounded the household head. Noise was intentional. A visible procession discouraged attack by advertising strength. It was safer to be seen as powerful than to pass unnoticed. The contrast with the poor was stark. Where elites used light and numbers, ordinary Romans relied on shadows and luck. This withdrawal reshaped the city's geography. Certain districts emptied after dark, becoming quiet islands surrounded by violent zones. Other areas, near taverns, markets, and insula, grew louder and more dangerous. Nighttime Rome was not uniformly lawless. It was uneven, divided by class and access to protection. Elite anxiety was not abstract. Ancient authors wrote candidly about fear. Pliny described the relief of reaching home safely. Martial joked darkly about nighttime assaults. Even emperors were cautious. Augustus famously organized the vigiles, not out of compassion, but fear of fire and disorder near elite quarters. Stability mattered most where wealth lived. This separation deepened resentment. The poor knew the elite slept safely while they navigated danger. Protection became a privilege, not a right. This imbalance fed the very gangs and mobs that made the night unsafe in the first place. Fear reproduced itself. The result was a city that functioned in 2 modes. By day, Rome projected power, law, and spectacle. By night, it revealed inequality, vulnerability, and retreat. The elite survived by withdrawal rather than control, conceding the streets to those with nothing to lose. Rome after dark was therefore not just criminal, it was political. It showed who mattered enough to be protected and who did not. And in that darkness, the city's deepest tensions moved freely, unchecked, waiting for daylight to pretend they did not exist. Not every group roaming Rome after dark was armed or overtly criminal. Some carried instruments instead of weapons. Street bands, singers, and drunken performers filled the night with noise, turning music into both entertainment and disruption. These groups blurred the line between celebration and menace, often attracting crowds that could shift from playful to violent without warning. Street music in Rome was rarely refined. It was loud, repetitive, and deliberately provocative. Drums, pipes, clapping, and chanting echoed through narrow streets, amplified by stone walls. Performers mocked passers-by, improvised insults, or sang obscene verses meant to draw laughter and attention. Humour was sharp-edged. If a target reacted badly, mockery could escalate into harassment or assault. Crowds formed quickly. Night encouraged anonymity, and anonymity encouraged cruelty. A dozen listeners became 50. Laughter became shouting. Someone shoved. Someone else responded. The music did not stop. It provided rhythm to chaos, binding individuals into a temporary collective. Once a crowd reached a certain size, it became bold. Doors were rattled. Windows were struck. Torches were waved dangerously close to buildings. These bands were often followed by youths looking for trouble. Music created cover. Noise masked footsteps and screams. If violence broke out, responsibility dissolved into the crowd. By the time watchmen arrived, if they arrived at all, the performers were gone and the street was littered with debris and blood. Elites despised these nocturnal gatherings. Writers complained that music after dark was a sign of disorder, not culture. Singing belonged in festivals and temples, not in the streets at midnight. But banning it was impossible. Music required no weapons, no organization, and no fixed location. It moved freely, just like the unrest it carried with it. Street bands also spread information. Songs mocked officials, spread rumors, and exaggerated scandals. News traveled faster through verse than proclamation. A catchy insult could damage reputations more effectively than violence. In this way, music became a form of power, soft enough to evade punishment, sharp enough to provoke response. These roaming groups show that Rome's nights were not ruled by fear alone. They were ruled by volatility. Entertainment, protest, and crime overlapped constantly. A celebration could become a riot. A joke could become a beating. Rome, after dark, pulsed with sound as much as danger. Music animated the streets, but it also loosened restraint. When voices joined together, individuality faded, and the city's most unpredictable force emerged, not the thief or the gang, but the crowd itself. Rome's response to nighttime crime was less about prevention and more about example. Punishment was public, theatrical, and deliberately humiliating, but it almost always occurred in daylight. Criminals who survived the night might face brutal consequences later, yet this delay weakened deterrence. Fear of punishment mattered less than the certainty of getting away with it in the moment. Roman justice relied heavily on reputation. Known troublemakers were watched, whispered about, and occasionally targeted. But anonymity at night disrupted this system. Darkness erased faces, blurred social rank, and protected the bold. A man who would never insult a superior by day might strike him unseen at night. When the sun rose, everyone pretended not to know who had been there. Punishments varied widely depending on status. Slaves caught committing crimes were whipped, branded, or executed. Freedmen faced fines, exile, or forced labor. Citizens, especially those with connections, often escaped with little more than public embarrassment. This imbalance taught an obvious lesson. Violence was safest when directed downward or sideways, never upward unless protected by darkness. Retribution frequently replaced law. Victims unable to seek justice through courts turned to informal revenge. Feuds simmered quietly until night provided opportunity. A stolen cloak led to a beating days later. An insult returned as an ambush. Nighttime justice was personal, cyclical, and deeply emotional. It solved nothing, but it felt immediate. Authorities tolerated this to a point. As long as violence remained localized and did not threaten elite districts or public order, it was ignored. Excessive unrest brought intervention, but that threshold was high. Rome preferred predictable disorder to unpredictable reform. Public punishment served another purpose: reinforcing daylight authority. Executions, floggings, and displays of criminal bodies reminded citizens that power still existed. These spectacles reassured elites and intimidated the poor, but they did little to change behavior after sunset. Night erased memory quickly. Reputation, not law, governed Rome after dark. Knowing the right people, belonging to the right group, or being feared mattered more than innocence. This created a moral landscape where survival outweighed justice. Rome's legal system was impressive in theory and brutal in display. But at night, it was distant. Justice slept. What remained was an older code, one enforced by fear, rumor, and retaliation. And in that darkness, the city revealed the limits of its civilization. Morning in Rome did not erase the night. It covered it. As the sun rose, streets were swept, blood washed into gutters, and broken furniture dragged aside. Shopkeepers reopened shutters as if nothing had happened. Neighbors avoided eye contact. The city resumed its daytime performance of order, law, and grandeur, carefully ignoring what had unfolded hours earlier. Victims limped home or sought help quietly. Reporting crimes was risky and often pointless. Without witnesses willing to speak, accusations dissolved. Many chose silence over retaliation. Others carried grudges forward, storing them for the next night when balance could be restored in shadow. Dawn did not end conflict. It postponed it. Daylight authority reasserted itself through routine. Magistrates sat in judgment. Markets bustled. Temples filled with worshippers. Rome projected confidence and stability to itself and to the world. Foreign visitors saw marble, ceremony, and discipline. They did not see the fear that governed ordinary people after sunset, or the calculations that shaped daily movement through the city. This dual existence defined Rome. By day, it was the heart of an empire ruled by law and spectacle. By night, it fragmented into countless small arenas where strength, numbers, and familiarity mattered more than citizenship. The same streets hosted triumphal processions and ambushes. The same city praised order while quietly accommodating chaos. What made this sustainable was acceptance. Romans understood the rhythm. You planned around the danger. You learned when to retreat and when to advance. Survival depended on knowing not just who you were, but when you were allowed to exist safely. The night belonged to the desperate, the reckless, and the prepared. Everyone else waited for dawn. Over time, this pattern hardened into tradition. Warnings about nighttime travel became moral advice. Fear became wisdom. The city taught its inhabitants how to live within its contradictions rather than resolve them. Rome did not eliminate its dark side, it scheduled it. This is why Rome after dark matters. Not because it was uniquely violent, but because it was honest about a truth many cities share. Civilization is thin. Law is conditional. When visibility fades and authority withdraws, older systems take over. When dawn returned, Rome looked eternal again. But beneath the marble and ritual lay the memory of the night, of thieves, gangs, music and fear, waiting patiently for the sun to fall once more and return the city to its other rulers. Long before roads stitched continents together, the sea quietly did the job first. For early human societies, water was not an edge of the world, but its most efficient pathway. A boat could move people, tools, food, and ideas faster and farther than any land route, and it did so without the obstacles that slowed caravans. Mountains, forests, and deserts divided communities. Water connected them. The earliest maritime cultures did not begin as explorers chasing the unknown. They began as coastal survivors. Fishing pushed people a short distance from shore. Storms carried them farther than planned. Curiosity followed necessity. Over time, those accidental journeys turned into deliberate ones. Shorelines became familiar, not frightening. Headlands, reefs, and river mouths formed mental maps passed from elder to apprentice, not written down but remembered through repetition. What made the sea usable was observation. Ancient sailors noticed that winds followed seasonal rhythms and that waves behaved differently depending on depth and coastline. They watched stars rise and set in consistent patterns and learned to associate them with direction. They noticed how birds disappeared at dusk and returned at dawn, signalling nearby land. None of this knowledge appeared suddenly. It accumulated slowly, tested by survival and refined by loss. Maritime travel demanded caution rather than bravery. Mistakes were punished immediately. A misjudged current or an ignored cloud could end an entire crew. This reality shaped maritime cultures into deeply conservative systems of knowledge. Innovation happened, but only after generations of proof. Oral tradition became sacred because forgetting meant dying. Life at sea also reshaped how people thought about space. Land cultures measured distance in territory and boundaries. Seafaring cultures measured it in time, wind, and watercolour. An island was not isolated if it lay within a day's sail. A distant coast was not foreign if the current flowed there reliably. The sea taught people to think in routes instead of borders. As these routes multiplied, contact became inevitable. Shells from distant shores, unfamiliar tools, and new foods appeared in coastal settlements. Trade began informally, then intentionally. What started as movement became exchange, and exchange became connection. The sea was humanity's first shared space. It linked communities that would never meet on land and allowed early civilizations to grow beyond their immediate environments. Long before empires, the ocean created networks, and those networks quietly shaped the ancient world. The Phoenicians did not dominate the sea by accident. Their homeland along the eastern Mediterranean was narrow, crowded, and poor in farmland. Expansion inland was difficult and often dangerous. The water, however, offered opportunity without resistance. Where others saw limitation, the Phoenicians saw direction. If land could not sustain them, the sea would. Their ships hugged coastlines at first, moving from harbour to harbour, learning every inlet and headland. Over time, these short voyages extended into deliberate routes that spanned the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians did not seek to rule territory in the traditional sense. They sought to control movement. A chain of coastal settlements allowed them to move goods efficiently while avoiding overextension. Each colony was a tool, not a city-state demanding loyalty. Trade defined Phoenician power. Timber, metals, glassware, and luxury goods flowed through their ports. Their most famous export, purple dye, required complex production and long-distance distribution, encouraging permanent maritime networks. The sea became a commercial system, not a frontier. Knowledge of tides, winds, and seasonal conditions was as valuable as cargo itself. Navigation relied on experience rather than instruments. Phoenician sailors memorized coastlines and learned to sail by the stars when land disappeared. They observed how the pole star remained fixed in the night sky and used it as a directional anchor. This was not abstract astronomy. It was practical survival knowledge, embedded in routine. What set the Phoenicians apart was their consistency. They sailed the same routes repeatedly, refining them over generations. Reliability created trust. Foreign ports came to expect Phoenician ships, and expectation turned into dependence. Trade routes hardened into economic arteries, binding distant communities together. Their maritime strategy also shaped culture. Phoenician society valued adaptability, negotiation, and pragmatism. Colonies blended with local populations rather than replacing them. Exchange flowed both ways. Languages mixed. Techniques spread. The sea did not erase difference, but it made cooperation profitable. Over time, Phoenician networks reached the edges of the known world. They moved beyond the Mediterranean, carrying familiar systems into unfamiliar waters. Yet their approach remained the same: cautious expansion, repeatable routes, and respect for the sea's rules. The Phoenicians did not conquer by force of arms. They conquered by presence. Their ships arrived regularly, predictably, and prepared. In doing so, they demonstrated a new form of power, one built not on walls or armies, but on mastery of movement itself. For the Minoans of Crete, the sea was not a boundary, but a defining feature of identity. Surrounded by water and positioned between mainland Greece, Anatolia, and Egypt, Crete sat at the centre of the Aegean world. This geography shaped a civilization that looked outward rather than inward, relying on ships instead of walls and routes instead of roads. Minoan cities were unusually open for their time. Many lacked heavy fortifications, a striking contrast to the war-focused cultures of the mainland. This was not naivete, it was confidence. Control of the sea meant early warning, mobility, and economic leverage. If danger approached, it would be seen from afar, long before it reached the shore. Maritime dominance replaced stone defences. Trade knitted the Aegean into a shared system. Minoan ships moved ceramics, textiles, metals, and agricultural goods between islands and coasts. These voyages were short but frequent, turning the sea into a predictable rhythm rather than a risky gamble. Islands functioned as nodes in a network, each one reachable within a familiar sailing window. Distance became manageable. Navigation in the Aegean depended heavily on visual cues. Sailors followed coastlines, mountain silhouettes, and island chains that never fully disappeared from sight. Seasonal winds dictated schedules. Voyages respected timing rather than challenging it. This produced a maritime culture focused on coordination, not conquest. The sea also shaped Minoan religion and art. Marine imagery filled their frescoes. Dolphins, fish, waves, and ships appeared everywhere. Deities were associated with water and fertility rather than war. Rituals reflected dependence on successful voyages and calm seas. The ocean was not feared, it was integrated into daily life. Maritime connectivity allowed ideas to travel as easily as goods. Artistic styles spread across the Aegean. Techniques in pottery, architecture, and metallurgy appeared in distant places with local variations. Cultural exchange became continuous rather than exceptional. The Minoan example shows a different model of power. Instead of expanding through military pressure, they expanded through presence and participation. The sea rewarded cooperation, predictability, and mutual benefit. Conflict disrupted trade and was therefore avoided when possible. For centuries, this system worked. Crete thrived as a maritime hub, linking distant cultures into a loose but effective web. When that network finally collapsed, it was not because the sea failed, but because the balance that sustained it did. Until then, the Minoans demonstrated how water could unify a region more effectively than land ever could. If Mediterranean sailors mastered coasts, Austronesian seafarers mastered the void. From island Southeast Asia into the vast Pacific and Indian Oceans, these cultures developed a way of navigating that did not depend on landmarks at all. They crossed open water for days or weeks, guided by memory, observation, and an intimate understanding of the sea itself. What they achieved remains one of humanity's greatest navigational feats. Austronesian expansion began gradually. Short crossings between visible islands came first. Over generations, those crossings lengthened. Familiar routes became launching points for new ones. Eventually, sailors departed with no land in sight, trusting patterns learned through long experience. This was not exploration driven by chance, it was migration by design. Their vessels reflected this philosophy. Outrigger canoes and double-hulled boats were engineered for stability rather than brute speed. They flexed with waves instead of fighting them. Sails were shaped to work with shifting winds, allowing long-distance travel without exhausting crews. These ships were not temporary tools. They were central to social life, built with ritual care and communal effort. Navigation relied on a layered mental map. Stars provided direction at night, each one rising and setting along known paths. During the day, sailors read swells, long ocean waves that maintain direction even when winds change. They watched cloud formations that hinted at land beyond the horizon. Birds, floating debris and watercolor all offered clues. Nothing was ignored. Everything mattered. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in chants, stories, and apprenticeship. Young navigators memorized star paths and sea signs the way others memorized genealogies. Forgetting was not an option. Accuracy was survival. The result was a human web stretched across half the planet. Islands thousands of kilometers apart shared languages, crops, and traditions. Plants like taro and breadfruit moved with people. Domesticated animals crossed oceans. The Pacific did not isolate these societies, it connected them. What distinguishes Austronesian maritime culture is intention. These were not accidental drifters. They carried families, tools, and plans. New islands were settled systematically, not stumbled upon. Each successful voyage expanded the known world and refined the knowledge system for the next. In mastering the open ocean, Austronesian sailors redefined what was possible. They proved that with patience, observation, and respect for natural patterns, even the largest sea could become a navigable landscape. Where others saw emptiness, they saw roots, and followed them with extraordinary precision. Ancient ships were not fixed inventions. They were living technologies, constantly adjusted to suit local seas, purposes, and cultural needs. Every maritime culture shaped its vessels according to wind patterns, water depth, cargo type, and distance. A ship that worked in calm coastal waters could fail catastrophically in open ocean, and ancient builders understood this through experience rather than theory. Mediterranean ships favoured broad hulls and shallow drafts, allowing them to approach beaches and small harbours easily. These designs sacrificed speed for stability and cargo capacity. Oars provided reliability when winds failed, while sails expanded range when conditions allowed. Steering systems evolved from side-mounted paddles to stern rudders, improving control and safety. Each improvement was adopted slowly, only after proving its worth. In contrast, oceanic vessels prioritized balance and endurance. Outrigger and double-hulled canoes distributed weight across a wider base, reducing the risk of capsizing. Flexibility mattered more than rigidity. These ships were designed to ride waves rather than resist them. Materials were chosen not for permanence, but for repairability. A damaged plank at sea had to be fixed with what was available. Construction itself was social. Ships were built communally, often accompanied by ritual. The vessel was more than a tool, it was an extension of the community. Names were given. Ceremonies marked launch and first voyage. A failed ship reflected collective failure, while a successful one elevated the builder's status. Navigation tools remained minimal, but ship design compensated. Sails were shaped to catch prevailing winds rather than chase unpredictable gusts. Hulls were tuned to familiar sea states. In many cultures, the ship and the navigator formed a single system. One without the other was useless. Maintenance was constant. Salt, sun, and water punished materials relentlessly. Crews learned to listen to their ships, noticing subtle changes in sound and movement. Creaking timbers or sluggish response warned of danger. Seamanship was sensory as much as intellectual. The adaptability of ship technology allowed maritime cultures to expand without central planning. Each successful voyage fed knowledge back into design. Failures taught lessons remembered for generations. This iterative process produced vessels perfectly matched to their environments. What emerges is a reminder that ancient maritime success did not rely on dramatic breakthroughs. It relied on refinement. Ships evolved alongside sailors, shaped by lived experience rather than abstract theory. In this partnership between human and vessel, the sea became navigable, not conquered, but understood well enough to cross again and again. Ancient sailors did not navigate empty water. They moved through an invisible landscape shaped by wind, current, and season. Long before charts or instruments, maritime cultures learned that the sea had structure. Understanding that structure meant the difference between arrival and disappearance. Winds were the most obvious guide. In the Mediterranean, seasonal patterns dictated sailing calendars. Certain months favoured eastward travel, others westward. Ignoring these rhythms invited disaster. Sailors waited patiently for the right conditions, even when delay meant hunger or missed opportunity. Timing mattered more than speed. Currents were subtler, but just as powerful. Some carried ships reliably along coasts. Others pulled vessels toward open water or dangerous shallows. Experienced sailors felt these forces through changes in motion and resistance. The sea communicated constantly to those trained to listen. This knowledge was not universal. It belonged to specialists, navigators whose experience granted authority. They advised when to depart, which route to follow, and when to turn back. Their judgments were rarely questioned. A wrong decision at sea endangered everyone aboard. Celestial observation completed the map. Stars marked direction, but also season and latitude. The rising and setting points of key stars shifted predictably throughout the year. Sailors tracked these movements mentally, building a three-dimensional understanding of space without written reference. Importantly, this map was dynamic. Storms altered currents temporarily. Volcanic activity and earthquakes reshaped coastlines. Knowledge had to be flexible. Oral tradition preserved core patterns while allowing adaptation. Stories encoded practical information, disguising navigation lessons as myth and memory. This invisible map enabled long-distance trade and migration without centralized control. Routes emerged organically, reinforced by repeated success. A safe passage became tradition. Dangerous waters became taboo. Over time, the sea itself dictated human movement. What modern readers often miss is restraint. Ancient sailors rarely challenged the sea unnecessarily. They worked within its rules. When voyages failed, they were remembered as warnings rather than inspirations. Respect, not conquest, defined maritime thinking. The sea was not empty space to be crossed blindly. It was a patterned environment that rewarded attentiveness. Those who learned its rhythms could travel far with surprising reliability. Those who ignored them vanished. Ports were the true engines of ancient maritime cultures. They were not just places where ships docked, but where worlds overlapped. Every harbour functioned as a point of compression, forcing people, languages, goods, and ideas into close contact. What happened in ports reshaped societies far beyond the shoreline. Most ancient ports were improvised rather than monumental. A sheltered bay, a river mouth, or a break in the rocks was often enough. Over time, repeated use transformed these natural features into hubs of activity. Wharves were added, storehouses appeared, taverns, markets, and temples followed. The sea dictated location, but humans built meaning around it. Harbours created diversity. Sailors arrived with unfamiliar customs, clothing, and beliefs. Merchants negotiated across cultural boundaries out of necessity. Interpreters became valuable. So did rituals of trust. Weights, measures, and shared commercial practices emerged to reduce uncertainty. Trade required cooperation, even among rivals. Ports were also places of vulnerability. Disease spread quickly through crowded docks. Conflicts flared easily among transient populations. Authorities struggled to impose order on spaces defined by movement rather than settlement. Many port cities developed reputations for lawlessness, but that chaos was a byproduct of connectivity, not failure. Maritime exchange reshaped diets and technologies. Crops moved along sea routes long before overland spread could match them. Fishing techniques, shipbuilding methods, and navigation practices circulated rapidly. A solution developed in one region might appear hundreds of kilometers away within a generation. Innovation traveled with sailors, not scholars. Cultural exchange was often subtle. Religious symbols blended, myths merged. Artistic styles shifted as foreign motifs were absorbed and reinterpreted. Ports encouraged hybridity. Identity became flexible, negotiated daily rather than inherited rigidly. This adaptability strengthened maritime societies, allowing them to thrive amid constant change. Importantly, ports linked inland communities to global systems. Goods moved from ships to caravans, extending maritime networks far beyond the coast. A farmer who never saw the sea might still depend on it for tools, salt, or luxury items. The ocean's influence reached deeper than its waves. Ports also shaped power. Control of a harbour meant control of access. Rulers invested heavily in securing key maritime nodes, knowing that influence flowed through them. Yet no authority ever fully owned a port. Its nature resisted permanence. Ships arrived, unloaded, and departed, carrying loyalty with them. In ancient maritime cultures, ports were where the sea touched society most directly. They transformed movement into connection, turning waterborne routes into human networks that quietly bound distant civilizations together. For all their knowledge and skill, ancient sailors never believed the sea was fully predictable. Every voyage carried risk, and that uncertainty shaped maritime psychology as much as technology. The ocean demanded humility. It punished arrogance and rewarded caution, but even the most careful planning could fail. To live with this reality, seafaring cultures developed rituals that gave meaning to danger. Before departure, ceremonies were common. Offerings were made to sea deities, ancestors, or protective spirits. These acts were not superstition in the modern sense. They were emotional tools, helping crews confront fear and reinforce solidarity. A voyage begun without ritual felt reckless, as though something essential had been neglected. At sea, discipline mattered. Crews followed strict routines, not only for efficiency, but for morale. Order created a sense of control in an environment that offered little. Songs coordinated labour and eased tension. Silence marked moments of concentration. Even small disruptions could escalate anxiety, so behaviour was regulated carefully. Storms tested these systems. Ancient ships could not outrun bad weather, they endured it. Decisions made under pressure revealed hierarchy and trust. Navigators became focal points of hope or blame. When a storm passed, survival was often attributed to correct ritual as much as correct technique. This reinforced tradition and justified continued adherence. The sea also shaped attitudes toward fate and loss. Disappearances were common. Ships failed to return without explanation. Bodies were rarely recovered. Grief lacked closure. Maritime cultures developed narratives that accepted uncertainty as part of life. Songs, myths, and memorial practices honoured those lost to water, rather than demanding answers the sea would never give. This acceptance produced resilience. Sailors learned to leave without guarantees and to return without certainty of recognition. Identity became fluid, shaped by movement and absence. Home was defined by memory as much as location. Risk also influenced decision-making. Voyages were planned conservatively. Cargo was balanced carefully. Redundancy was built into routes and alliances. Maritime cultures thrived not because they ignored danger, but because they anticipated it. What emerges is a culture of respect rather than domination. The sea was not an enemy to be conquered, but a force to be negotiated with. Knowledge reduced risk, but it never erased it. Ritual filled the emotional gap that knowledge could not. In this way, ancient maritime cultures balanced rational observation with symbolic practice. Together, they formed a psychology capable of facing the vast unknown repeatedly and returning to it willingly, generation after generation. By the end of antiquity, the sea had already done its quiet work. Long before empires drew borders or armies marched inland, maritime cultures had connected distant coasts into shared systems of exchange. The ancient world was not a collection of isolated civilizations. It was a web, woven first by boats, routes, and repeated crossings. What these cultures achieved was not uniformity, but familiarity. People did not become the same. They became aware of one another. Goods moved, but so did stories, techniques, and expectations. A sailor arriving in a foreign port did not arrive blindly. He recognized tools, gestures, and customs shaped by earlier contact. The sea created continuity across difference. Maritime networks also shaped power indirectly. States that mastered the sea influenced events far beyond their shores without constant warfare. Control of routes mattered more than possession of land. Access replaced ownership. Influence travelled with cargo rather than soldiers. This model of power proved durable, adaptable, and difficult to dismantle. The sea also democratized connection. Unlike monumental roads or fortified borders, water routes required no central authority to exist. They formed through use. Anyone with a vessel and knowledge could participate. This openness allowed innovation to spread quickly and prevented any single culture from fully monopolizing maritime space for long. At the same time, the sea imposed limits. It resisted absolute control. Storms ignored borders. Currents disregarded ambition. Maritime cultures survived by working within these constraints rather than denying them. Their success lay in alignment, not domination. The legacy of ancient maritime cultures is therefore subtle but profound. They taught humanity how to think beyond immediate surroundings, how to imagine distance as reachable, and how to treat movement as opportunity rather than threat. They normalized contact, exchange, and adaptation. Modern globalization did not invent connection. It accelerated patterns established thousands of years earlier by sailors who memorized stars and trusted winds. The frameworks of trade, migration, and cultural blending all trace back to these early experiments in mobility. The sea shaped how civilizations grew, interacted, and understood themselves. It was the first space where human societies learned to coexist without conquest, connected by necessity rather than ideology. In the ancient world, the sea was not a backdrop to history. It was its architect, quietly binding continents together long before anyone imagined the world as a single place.